June 6, 1944, 6:29 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The ramps are still up. Inside the Higgins Boat, 32 U.S. Army infantrymen from the 1st Infantry Division stand shoulder to shoulder, rifles clutched tight, vomit and seawater sloshing around their boots. The engine roars behind them. German machine gun fire snaps overhead like tearing canvas. Someone is praying. Someone is screaming. No one can see the beach clearly through the smoke. 30 seconds. The coxswain fights the current, hands white around the wheel. The flat-bottomed craft slams against a hidden sandbar. The hull shudders. For a split second it feels too small, too thin, too exposed. The ramp drops, and history surges forward. The Higgins Boat, officially landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVP, was never supposed to be the vessel that carried an army across the English Channel. At least, that's what many in Washington believed. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a naval officer. He was not a graduate of Annapolis. He was a stubborn, sharp-tongued boat builder from New Orleans who built shallow-draft workboats for trappers and oilmen in the Louisiana bayous. His boats could skim over mud, pivot in tight water, and land where deeper vessels would run aground. The U.S. Navy had its own ideas about amphibious warfare. Traditional landing boats required soldiers to climb awkwardly over the sides. It was slow, clumsy, exposed. Higgins thought that was madness. He had seen Japanese landing craft with bow ramps during pre-war reports from China. Why, he asked, were American planners ignoring the obvious? Why force men to scramble over gunnels under fire? So he built his own prototype, flat-bottomed plywood sides, a blunt bow with a steel ramp that dropped forward. The Navy wasn't impressed. Some officers dismissed it as flimsy, civilian tinkering, a swamp boat dressed up for war. It wasn't built in an established naval yard. It didn't look like a warship. It looked improvised. But Higgins had something more dangerous than credentials. He had proof. During a demonstration on Lake Pontchartrain in 1941, Higgins ran the boat straight onto shore at full speed. The ramp crashed down. Men poured out in seconds. No climbing, no hesitation. Then he backed the boat off the beach just as quickly. Observers went quiet. Within months, as America edged closer to war, the Navy placed orders, then more orders, then thousands. By 1943, Higgins Industries in New Orleans was operating around the clock. Women welders, Rosie the riveters in denim and bandanas, assembled hulls from marine plywood. Engines were installed in rapid succession. Ramps were fitted with steel plating to withstand gunfire. At its peak, one boat rolled off the line every hour. Still, skepticism lingered in some corners. Could a plywood craft really survive against fortified Europe? Could something built for marshland really cross the channel under artillery fire? Even as Operation Overlord took shape in secret planning rooms across London, the question hung in the air. General Dwight D. Eisenhower studied invasion maps marked with tide charts and German defensive grids. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening Hitler's Atlantic Wall, had seeded the beaches with mines, Czech hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with explosives. He knew the Allies would come by sea. He intended to drown them before they ever reached dry sand. Everything depended on the first minutes. The first wave. The first 100 yards. And those 100 yards would belong not to battleships or bombers, but to thousands of small, flat-bottomed boats designed by a man many had once laughed at. In England, as dawn approached on June 6th, soldiers climbed down cargo nets from transports into the waiting LCVPs. The channel was rough. Men slipped. Some fell between hulls and disappeared. Engines coughed alive in the darkness. The armada stretched to the horizon, nearly 4,000 landing craft of various types, including over 1,500 Higgins boats. It was the largest amphibious invasion force in human history, and it rested on plywood and stubbornness. Back on Omaha Beach, as that first ramp hit the sand, German MG-42 machine guns opened up from the bluffs above. The sound was mechanical, relentless, 1,200 rounds per minute. Entire front ranks fell before their boots touched ground. Some Higgins boats were struck before unloading, ramps jammed, coxswains were killed at their posts, boats drifted sideways in the surf. But others kept coming, wave after wave. They grounded themselves deliberately, sacrificing hulls to deliver men closer to the seawall. Some backed off and returned for more troops. Others burned where they landed, smoke mixing with the fog of war. The design that critics called fragile allowed soldiers to charge straight ahead instead of scrambling helplessly over the sides. Seconds mattered. Those seconds meant lives. By mid-morning, the beach was chaos, bodies, wrecked craft, shattered obstacles. But American troops were pushing inland. And as the tide rose, broken Higgins boats floated back out to sea, scarred but unbroken symbols of something extraordinary. Far from the gunfire, in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower waited for reports. For hours, the outcome hung in balance. If the boats failed, the invasion would collapse. If they held, by nightfall, Hitler's Atlantic Wall would no longer be a wall. It would be a breach, and the world would never laugh at Andrew Higgins again. But the most dangerous hours were still ahead. 6:35 a.m., the tide is rising. Omaha Beach is no longer just sand. It is smoke, blood, and shattered wood. Another line of Higgins boats cuts through the gray surf, engines straining. Inside one of them, Captain Joe Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry Regiment, grips the railing as bullets punch through the thin plywood hull. Water sprays in through splintered seams. A soldier beside him is hit before he even sees the shore. The coxswain doesn't slow down. He can't. If he stops short, the men will have to wade hundreds of yards under direct fire. If he overshoots, the boat will stick fast on a sandbar and become a coffin. Ahead, German strongpoints, wider Stansnister, spit fire from concrete bunkers embedded into the cliffs. MG-42 teams sweep the waterline with surgical precision. Mortars thud from hidden pits. Artillery shells scream overhead and crash into the surf, throwing up geysers of salt water and steel. The ramp drops. Half the front rank collapses instantly. Dawson leaps over bodies and drives forward, screaming for his men to move. There is no time to think, no time to mourn. The only direction is ahead. Behind him, the Higgins boat backs hard into the current. The coxswain guns the engine, revering into chaos, dodging floating debris and the wounded struggling in the water. He turns back toward the transport ships, already searching for the next load of men. This is what the critics never calculated. The Higgins boat was not armor. It was not a fortress. It was a delivery system, brutally efficient. It existed to place infantry exactly where they needed to be as fast as physics allowed. And it was doing exactly that. Off to the west at Utah Beach, the story unfolds differently, but no less decisively. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division, steps off his Higgins boat with a cane in one hand and a pistol in the other. At 56 years old, arthritis racking his joints, he is the only general to land in the first wave. The current has pushed the landing craft nearly a mile south of their intended sector. The beach is quieter than expected, German resistance scattered and confused. An aide points out the error. Roosevelt studies the dunes for a moment, bullets cracking somewhere in the distance. "We'll start the war from right here," he says calmly. That decision, made in seconds, prevents chaos. Instead of re-embarking under fire to find the correct beach, the 4th Infantry Division pushes inland from the unexpected position. the mislanding becomes an advantage. And once again, it begins with a Higgins boat touching sand. Back at Omaha, the situation teeters on disaster. By 8:00 a.m., entire companies are pinned against the seawall. Radio communications are shredded. Amphibious DD tanks meant to support the infantry have sunk in the rough surf. Casualties mount into the thousands. From offshore, destroyers like USS Satterlee and USS McCook edge dangerously close to the beach, firing point-blank into German positions to relieve pressure. But reinforcements keep arriving. Higgins boat after Higgins boat punches through the chaos, delivering engineers with Bangalore torpedoes to blast wire obstacles, medics, machine gun teams, officers trying desperately to reorganize shattered units. The design proves its worth in the smallest details. The shallow draft allows coxswains to run closer to shore than deeper craft. The forward ramp means wounded can be dragged back aboard quickly. The maneuverability lets skilled pilots pivot away before becoming stationary targets. Many boats are destroyed, but many more survive long enough. And that is enough. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler is asleep when the first reports arrive. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had long argued over how to repel an invasion. Rommel insisted the Allies must be stopped at the water's edge. Rundstedt believed in a mobile armored reserve inland. Now, with Allied troops clawing their way up the bluffs, the debate becomes irrelevant. Because the wall has been touched. And once touched, it can be torn open. By late morning, small groups of American soldiers begin scaling the cliffs at Omaha using craters and natural gullies for cover. Lieutenant Walter Taylor leads men through a draw toward Colville. Engineers blow gaps in barbed wire. Snipers are silenced one nest at a time. The breakthrough is not cinematic. It is messy, fragmented, improvised. But it is happening. Each foothold inland traces back to a simple mechanical act. A ramp slamming down, boots hitting sand, a boat revering into surf for the next wave. Nearly 20,000 American troops will land at Omaha on D-Day. At Utah, another 23,000. Across the 5 beaches, including British and Canadian sectors, over 156,000 Allied soldiers set foot in Normandy on June 6. The majority arrived in small landing craft modeled after Higgins' design. Plywood steel ramp, 36 feet long. That was the spearpoint of liberation. That evening, as reports stabilize, Eisenhower receives word. The beachheads are secure. Barely. More than 2,400 Americans lie dead on Omaha alone. Thousands more are wounded. The cost is staggering. But the Atlantic Wall has been breached. German commanders had prepared for an invasion fleet. They had fortified against battleships and bombers. What they could not fully stop was repetition. Boat after boat, wave after wave, relentless delivery. Andrew Higgins himself is not on the beach that day. He is in the United States, overseeing production, already preparing for future operations in the Pacific. He will later say simply, "The boat won the war." It sounds like pride. But Eisenhower will echo something similar. And when the Supreme Commander finally reflects on what made D-Day possible, he will point not to a general, not to a battleship, but to a stubborn boat builder from Louisiana. Yet the story of the Higgins boat did not end in Normandy. Because the same design that cracked Hitler's fortress would soon be hurled against islands soaked in even fiercer resistance. And the Pacific would test it in ways the Atlantic never did. November 20th, 1943, 9:02 a.m. Tarawa Atoll, Central Pacific. The lagoon is deceptively calm. Higgins boats grind forward in tight formation toward a thin strip of coral and palm trees, Batio Island. U.S. Marines of the 2nd Marine Division stand packed inside the LCVPs, faces streaked with sweat and blackened cork from their helmets. The tropical sun burns overhead. Ahead, Japanese naval guns begin to fire. The coral reef waits just beneath the surface. Then the engines strain. And stop. The Higgins boats are stuck. Tarawa was supposed to be straightforward. Naval bombardment had pounded the island for hours. Planners believed the rising tide would carry landing craft cleanly over the reef and onto the beach. They were wrong. The tide does not rise high enough. LCVP after LCVP grinds against coral hundreds of yards from shore, hulls scraping violently. Coxswains slam throttles in frustration. Marines are forced to climb over the sides into chest-deep water, rifles held high, wadding toward beaches already zeroed in by Japanese machine guns. The scene is brutal, methodical, merciless. Unlike Normandy, there are no bluffs to scale, nowhere to hide. The beach is narrow, flat, and entirely exposed. Japanese defenders from reinforced bunkers fire with disciplined precision. The Higgins boat, designed to skim shallow waters, has met the one obstacle it cannot defeat: coral. But even here, its presence matters. Where water is deep enough, ramps crash down and Marines pour out fast, minimizing exposure. Where boats are disabled, others maneuver around them, pressing closer, risking everything to shorten the deadly wade. Some LCVPs are riddled with bullets, others catch fire. Coxswains are killed with hands still on throttles, yet replacements keep arriving. The production lines back home ensured there would always be another boat. Relentless delivery. That was the design philosophy. Andrew Higgins had fought constantly with Navy bureaucracy before the war. He hired women and minorities when other factories would not. He challenged contracts. He argued loudly. He offended admirals. But he produced. By 1944, Higgins Industries had built more than 20,000 landing craft of various types, including over 12,000 LCVPs. They would land soldiers in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, southern France. They would storm Pacific islands from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. General Eisenhower would later say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." It was not exaggeration, it was logistics. Because amphibious warfare is mathematics, it is tonnage and timing. It is how many men can be placed on hostile sand within the first hour before defenders can react. The Higgins boat turned theory into repetition. And repetition breaks walls. Back in Europe, June turns into July. The fragile beachheads in Normandy expand slowly, painfully. Hedgerows become killing fields. German panzer divisions counterattack. Rain turns fields into mud. But the supply line holds. Every day, more men, more jeeps, more artillery pieces arrive across the channel. Landing craft shuttle continuously between transports and shore. Even as artificial mulberry harbors are constructed, the simple LCVP remains indispensable. At Utah and Omaha, at Gold and Juneau, at Sword, the image repeats. Flat-bottomed boats surging forward, ramps dropping, soldiers sprinting into history. Hitler had believed the Atlantic Wall would force the Allies into a catastrophic frontal slaughter. He had counted on fortified concrete, overlapping fields of fire, mined beaches. He did not account for industrial audacity. He did not account for an American civilian who saw warfare as a production challenge. The Higgins boat was not glamorous. It was not heavily armored. It would never dominate a poster. But it multiplied courage. And in war, multiplication changes everything. In the Pacific, lessons from Tarawa reshape amphibious doctrine. New landing craft, LVT amphibious tractors, are deployed in greater numbers to cross reefs. Naval bombardments grow longer, more precise. Intelligence improves tidal calculations. But the Higgins boat never disappears. It continues delivering troops once beaches are secured. It ferries supplies under fire. It evacuates wounded. It remains the connective tissue between fleet and frontline. By the time Marines raised the flag over Iwo Jima in February 1945, thousands more Higgins boats have completed their runs. Some are scarred with shrapnel holes patched in plywood. Some carry burn marks from near misses. All of them bear the marks of repetition. And somewhere in that repetition lies the real reversal. The men who once dismissed Higgins' design as flimsy had imagined war in grand symbols, battleships, carriers, massive guns. They did not imagine that victory would hinge on a 36-foot craft powered by a single diesel engine. They laughed at the simplicity, until simplicity overwhelmed fortification, until ramps dropped at Normandy, until coral reefs echoed with Marine rifle fire, until the Atlantic Wall was no longer a wall, but a memory. By war's end, more than 400,000 Higgins boats and other landing craft of similar design would be built across American industry. They had carried millions of soldiers into combat. Plywood and steel, vision and stubbornness. But as victory celebrations erupted in 1945, Andrew Higgins would discover something bitter. Because the same government that had once doubted him would soon forget him. And the boat that helped win a world war would quietly fade from memory. August 1945, New Orleans, Louisiana. The factory floor is quieter now. Where once engines roared and welding torches flared through the night, only a few workers remain, dismantling assembly lines that had run without pause for nearly 4 years. Stacks of unused marine plywood lean against the walls. Half-finished hulls sit abandoned, their ramps frozen in place, as if waiting for one last order that will never come. Andrew Jackson Higgins walks the floor slowly. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. Japan has followed. Across Europe and the Pacific, soldiers are coming home, many of them stepping off ships that had once been loaded by Higgins boats. He should be triumphant. Instead, contracts are being canceled. During the war, Higgins Industries had employed more than 20,000 workers. Women, African Americans, immigrants, many given opportunities denied elsewhere. The company had produced not just LCVPs, but larger LCMs and PT boats. The assembly lines had become a symbol of American industrial momentum. But Higgins was never easy to work with. He argued with Navy procurement officials. He challenged pricing structures. He bypassed bureaucracy when it slowed production. He made enemies in Washington. In wartime, results protected him. In peacetime, results mattered less. Within months of VJ Day, military orders dried up. Government support shifted. Lawsuits and contract disputes followed. By 1946, Higgins Industries was in financial collapse. The man whose boats had carried armies onto hostile shores watched his company unravel. There would be no massive post-war celebration in his honor, no parades down Fifth Avenue, no monument on the National Mall. The boats themselves were sold as surplus. Some were scrapped, others converted into fishing vessels or workboats along American coasts. A few were abandoned to rot in quiet harbors, their plywood finally surrendering to time. And yet, in Europe, veterans of Omaha Beach remembered the sound of that ramp dropping. In the Pacific, Marines who survived Tarawa remembered clinging to the sides of Higgins boats as bullets snapped overhead. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later reflect privately on what made D-Day possible. He listed many factors: air superiority, deception operations like fortitude, naval bombardment, Allied coordination. But when asked about Andrew Higgins, he did not hesitate. If Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, Eisenhower said, we never could have landed over an open beach. the whole strategy of the war would have been different. That was not flattery. That was strategic truth. Because without the ability to place infantry directly onto defended shores, rapidly, repeatedly, the Allies would have faced a far narrower set of options. Fortress Europe might have required years more of attritional warfare. The Pacific island-hopping campaign would have slowed to a crawl. The Higgins Boat compressed time. It shortened wars. Today, a restored LCVP sits in museums, wood and steel preserved under controlled light. Visitors walk past it quietly. Children look at its blunt nose and simple ramp and sometimes ask the same question critics once asked. That's it. Yes, that's it. 36 feet of practical design, a shallow draft of barely 3 feet, capacity for 36 troops or a jeep and 12 men, a single diesel engine, a steel bow ramp that changed amphibious warfare forever. It does not look like the instrument that cracked Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But on June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over Normandy and ramps slammed down into surf stained red, it was the only thing that mattered. You can almost hear it, the metallic crash of the ramp, the shouted commands, the roar of engines revering into chaos. And in that split second between sea and sand, between safety and slaughter, the laughter stopped. Because the boat they mocked had delivered an army. It had turned skepticism into shock. It had turned plywood into a bridge between continents. It had turned a civilian stubborn idea into one of the most decisive innovations of the Second World War. The Atlantic Wall did not fall to one general. It fell to repetition, to courage multiplied, to thousands of small ramps dropping in unison. And somewhere in that thunder of engines and gunfire, Andrew Higgins' gamble proved itself, not in theory, not in a boardroom demonstration, but in the most unforgiving test imaginable. War. And